Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to our workshop. My name is Anastasios Perimenis. I'm the Secretary General of CO2 Value Europe, and I welcome you warmly to our second workshop for the year on the future of carbon capture and utilization deployment from a national and European perspective. This workshop is taking place under the umbrella of the European Industry Days, the lighthouse event where different stakeholders join into in a virtual platform to discuss about the industrial strategy and different challenges and opportunities of the industrial world. And what better way to talk about the CCU industry than an event within and under the auspices of the EU Industry Days. For those who don't know us, we are CO2 Value Europe, so the European association representing the CCU community and working so that the CCU industry is developed from a nascent industry to an established industry, and provide the advantages of CCU and realize the advantages of CCU towards climate change protection. So we are representing around 70 members of along the entire value chain. So from multinational companies that emit CO2 to specialized SMEs that provide technology to convert CO2 into different types of products. We also have regional clusters in our membership, research institutions, universities, and looking at the value chain of CO2 valorization. So starting from the CO2, either from point sources or directly captured from the air, using renewable energy and raw materials or waste materials as input to convert them to a series of marketable products like chemicals, fuels, or building materials. So we are the only association that is concentrated in carbon capture and utilization. And we are, through a series of workshops, monthly workshops, we are bringing to the attention of a variety of stakeholders the advantages of CCU and the challenges and opportunities behind them. So we have started in December last year with mineralization as a subject. In January, we explained the link between renewable energy production and CCU. Today's workshop, we want to bring to the attention of the audience two perspectives: the European perspective on CCU deployment and the national perspective. And for that, I'm very glad to have a very interesting lineup of speakers. After this small introduction, you will first hear from Célia Sapart, the Director of Communication and Climate Science at CO2 Value Europe, explaining the perspective of the CCU industry in the European context. And then we will present some national case studies. We will start with Petrus, Postma, manager of CO2 Smart Use, explaining what CO2 Smart Use is as a network of CCU professionals in the Netherlands. And then we will hear about the South Holland CCU program from Juliana Unger, International Project Manager at Cleantech Delta. The second case study would be presented by Luis Diaz Fernandez, who is the president of the Spanish CO2 Technology platform, and he will explain the Spanish situation on CCU. And then we will close the speaker session with Linda Veldhuizen, that is the program coordinator of Synergy, a major research initiative on solar fuels and chemicals. And she will explain how the CCU research and development needs can match the European industry realities. We will have a good half an hour for Q&A. So I would like to ask you to use the Q&A function of your Zoom link. We will monitor the Q&A and we will ask the questions. Whenever you like, also mention who your question is addressed to. And as a closing, let's say, session, we would like to ask you to use the chat function and present on your, let's say, key message of the workshop. So instead of us closing with some remarks, we would like to use your remarks as a closing session. So for you, what is the important takeaway message from this workshop? Please put it in a chat and we will describe it in the closing session. So the workshop is recorded and you will get all the material and the presentations and the recording afterwards. In a couple of days, it will be available in our website. Without further delay, then I will give directly the floor to Célia, who will explain the perspectives of the CCU industry in the European context. And I'm stop sharing and I'll give the word to Célia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anastasios, for this interesting introduction. Can you see my screen, just to make sure?
I can see your screen, yeah.
Great, thank you. So today I'm going to give an overview on the CCU industry in the European context, and I'm going to start with a very brief description of the principle of carbon capture and utilizations for people who are not yet introduced to this subject. So it consists of capturing the CO2 or directly from the air, from the atmosphere, or from flue gas emissions, and then convert the CO2 using renewable energy. We also use renewable energy for the capture, but even more most of the time in the conversion step, because we need green hydrogen, so hydrogen that is created via the water and the renewable energy. And the conversion of CO2 help us to create CO2-based products, such as e-fuels, chemicals, and materials. And this allows to create a net reduction of CO2 emissions. So we'll remove the emissions from, if we take them from the flue gas. But then if we capture the end-of-life emissions, it means that we can reach net zero emissions, so that at the end nothing is emitted to the atmosphere. But we can also create a third impact, is that when we store CO2 into materials, into building materials, via the mineralization process, CO2 is sequestered permanently in the material. So especially when we use direct air capture, so we remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, we store it in the material, it creates negative emissions. Our vision at CO2 Value Europe is to make CCU a key pillar of the transition towards a sustainable economy. So we do not say that CCU is the solution, we say that CCU is part of the solution, it's a component of a sustainable economy with other very important solutions. For example, improve the process energy efficiency, develop renewable energy systems, the electrification of processes, the use of biomass, of hydrogen, or carbon capture and storage. But for us, it's very important that the solutions are good for the climate, so are creating net reductions of global CO2 emissions, but also that what the big advantage of CCU, that it's not only reducing the emissions, it's also creating a new carbon feedstock to defossilize the processes, so to replace the fossil carbon by utilizing CO2 as a feedstock, especially for the chemicals, materials, and fuel industry. And it also help or support the development of a circular economy in creating valuable products from industrial waste. CCU is growing quite fast over the last years. It has more and more media attention. We can really see it weekly or even daily in the news at the international level. So this is very important, and it's really steadily growing over the last few months and few years. And there is also always more research on CCU. We can really see CCU papers also in high impact journals really popping up months after months. So this is a very good news, especially because we crucially need to quantify the role of the different CCU paths to quantify their environmental and climate impact. CCU also is always more present in projects. Here you have an overview. It's not all the projects, but it's a project that are currently in our database, because we are making a company and project database in the association. And you can see that we have more than 50 high TRL projects. So come from demonstration to the commercialization. So this is a very important step to show what is happening on our continent. And here an example of 3 of the projects. You have the Norske Field projects in Norway. So the idea is to take CO2 directly from the air, so via the direct air capture, to use renewable energy to create hydrogen and to create jet fuel. So they aim to create 10 million liters of jet fuel by 2023 and 100 million by 2026. So it's already a project that is advancing quite good. Then another example here in the south of France, the power to gas project called Jupiter 1000. It's a project where CO2 from flue gas is taken with hydrogen and created from renewable energy. So we call it green hydrogen to create methane, so natural gas. So it's also a kind of synthetic fuel. And this methane based on CO2 is already now injected in the national gas network in this region. And another example here is a capstone innovation in Belgium, innovation from Vito and Orbix. So they create stones from industrial residue and from CO2. They can store 2 tons of CO2 per 100 square meter of stones, and they have created the first pavements made out of CO2 in the city of Ghent some months ago. At CO2 Value, we are also supporting the development of projects, also participating in projects, and currently we are involved in 3 projects, and soon it will be 5 because we got 2 extra projects funded. Here an example of 2 of them. It's a project Initiate and the project Takeoff. Both are led by a TNO in the Netherlands, and we are work package leader for the communication and dissemination, and we are also helping on the legislative part and on the standardization. The Initiate project has for goal to use emissions from the metallurgy, so the CO2 emission from that, to create fertilizers, especially urea. And the Takeoff project use also flue gas emissions to create jet fuel, also called sustainable aviation fuels. So the Initiate project, it's an innovation action, and the Takeoff project is a research and innovation action, so a little bit lower TRL. So our activities are going around 3 key pillars. The first one is that we want to become a hub of knowledge sharing on the subject of Ccu technologies. So we are mutualizing information and technologies. So what is happening, where it is happening, and who is involved. So we also are creating a stakeholder database, as I said, and also a database on projects and companies. And we contribute to the strategic research and innovation roadmaps, for example, the PPP's Spire or the CETP or Sun Energy Initiative. We are going to discuss about it a bit later in this workshop. And we also work on upscaling and innovation. So we connect the partner and help them access EU and private fundings. And we are also participating ourselves in different projects. So for now, we have the Impacts project that is part of the set plan, the CCUS set plan, with the Initiate project, as I said before, the Takeoff project, and we have 2 new granted projects on CO2 to chemicals that will start a bit later this year. And we are also doing a lot of work on the communication and on the advocacy to raise awareness on CCU and to make sure that it is recognized for its right value. We do also analysis on the policy context around CCU at the EU level, and we are also now going more and more to the national level. That's one of our plans. And we advocate for the creation of a favorable regulatory framework around CCU. And as I said before, we communicate and raise awareness on CCU's potential at all levels. So at the policymaker level, but also to increase the public acceptance, so it for the general public. So considering the support and the research, innovation and deployment, so the EU has put in place different mechanisms to promote clean tech technology, and CCUS has now its place in those different mechanisms. So the EU has set its EU strategic energy plan, the set plans you see here on the left, where CCU is included as a priority at the same level as CCS. And this platform unites member states, industries, the commissions, and further stakeholders to promote rapid deployment of clean energy solutions. And us as CO2 Value Europe, we are representing CCU in the implementation plan of this priority. Then you have here below the Innovation Fund. It's based on the ETS funding, so the ETS, the emission trading system. And Ccu Technology are now included as one of the 4 pillars of this innovation plan. It represents 10 billion euros in 10 years' time to support innovative low-carbon projects that can provide a significant climate impact. And as CO2 Value Europe, we represent the CCU community in the commission of experts of the innovation plan. Then you have the IPCEI here on the right. It's an important project of common interest, supporting the development of large-scale transnational projects where member states, in fact, receive the permission from the EU to support industrial actors at a level that would not otherwise be allowed by the state aid regulations. And there is a series of strategic value chain that have been identified in the development of this instrument, including 2 related, strategic value chain related to CCU. And you have the Horizon Europe, which is a successor of Horizon 2020, and it has about 20 topics related to CCU. The key messages that we bring so to the different stakeholders, but especially when we work on advocacy, is that CCU technology are technically ready for large-scale deployment. So it's not the technology that is breaking the deployment. And CCU technologies, they can be used immediately, especially when we use e-fuel to reduce net CO2 emissions. CCU technology require renewable electricity, but they will also support this clean energy transition by facilitating electricity take-up, but also the storage of electricity, for example, via the Power-to-X principle, and the transport of this electricity. And CCU technologies and products can be used with the existing infrastructure, and this is very important. And this is why also CCU brings drop-in solutions, especially when creating e-fuels. The methane you create out of CO2 or the methanol or other fuels can be used with the existing infrastructure. So this is a very important point. But there is a crucial need of supportive regulatory or market framework to help the deployment of CCU technology, and we are intensively working on that in CO2 Value Europe. So concerning the regulatory framework, recently the EU Parliament has firmly decided to really take this global leadership in mitigating climate change, in accepting with a very large majority the first EU climate law. And this climate law acts the carbon neutrality by 2050, but also a decrease of 55% in total greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by 2030. So this is a very important statement. And to reach these goals, we strongly believe that the role of CCU technology should be acknowledged, and we are working in that sense. And there is, of course, the EU Green Deal, which is the umbrella of all the different legislative packages that are linked to reaching these climate goals and these climate laws. And many instruments are now or will soon be revised to fulfill the obligations of the climate law. And this represents a very good opportunity for all of us to make sure that CCU is fairly recognized for its value in the key instruments. So you see some of them here. And we are working at doing advocacy work at CO2 Value Europe in that sense. And but we have to realize that we are operating in a very complicated policy context, because sometimes CCU is considered or just cited in some of the legislative packages, but in other very important instruments, it's not considered at all. So first we need to analyze the different instruments and then see where CCU could be added. We have worked especially on the 3 top left instrument here, the EU, sorry, I have a little, yeah, EU Sustainable Taxonomy, where CCU is not included at that point, the Renewable Energy Directive number 2 that is being revised, and here we especially advocate for for the correct inclusion of CO2-based fuel. And in the ETS revision there, CCU is not recognized at all, and we really also advocate for its recognition. Oops, sorry. So what are the strategic priorities in the coming years, so in the coming decades, to build a CCU industry? The first one is to support the development of innovative projects. So here we give an example via the Innovation Fund, but also to raise visibility on CCU and to raise acceptance, also public acceptance, but acceptance at all levels. And one thing we do, for example, is to make sure that CCU is properly considered and is properly represented in important reports, such as a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are acting as reviewer there with our group of scientific experts now. Some of us are members and some of them are externals. So they are all academics working on CCU from different fields. And we really base all our communication on scientific evidence. But often the scientific evidence around CCU are not known from the climate community. So we are trying to raise knowledge in that sense. Another very important point is that to quantify the role of CCU to mitigate climate change, for example, via life cycle analysis, and also to propose concrete policy measures to support the deployment of CCU. We have written a manifesto, you can find it on our website, on policy recommendations, and we also have position papers, especially concerning the RED II and the ETS instruments that are both on our website. And it's also crucial to develop standardization because we might not need the same purity, for example, of CO2 for the different processes. And it's very important that this is well standardized if we want to go to upscale then the CCU industry, and to simply create the CCU industry, and also to raise interest for private ventures to help also for the development of this industry. So thank you very much for your attention. Do not hesitate to contact us if you have any question. Now we are on social media, more and more active. We also have a Twitter now. So yeah, do not hesitate to follow us, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Célia. We will. There are some questions coming in. We will gather them all for the end to let's say to spark the discussion in the last half hour. So for now, I would like to give the floor to Petrus to explain the situation in the Netherlands on CCU. Please, Petrus.
Yes, thank you very much, Anastasios. And of course, very many thanks to you, Célia, for introducing the field of CCU. I will tell you something about the Dutch context. And this is just a snapshot from our website, co2smartuse.com. So feel free to visit that one. But as Célia said a minute ago, in the end, what we want to achieve in the Netherlands is find a strong basis for a feedstock transition next to the energy transition, because in the end, we need an alternative carbon base, right? That's what we're working on. And we've been doing that from 2016. And when we started out, let's see. This is when we started out in 2016, because having carbon as a sustainable carbon base for industry wasn't in place in the Netherlands at all. We were working in the greenhouse industry on finding alternative CO2 sources to be able to stop using natural gas, but we created a collaboration with these organizations in 2016 to put CO2 as a feedstock for industry on the agenda. And from there, we've been working on a sustainable or life cycle analysis, on societal cost and benefit analysis, on economic assessments. And in the end, what we concluded with these organizations is what we want to do is accelerate the CCU ecosystem in the Netherlands. So I'll tell you something about scope, about what we need concerning infrastructure, investment climate, subsidy frameworks, policy frameworks, and of course, the most important, network dynamics. Because if they work together, these topics, then we really can accelerate that industry. Well, for scope first, in the end, what we want to achieve is stop using fossil feedstocks, stop the fossil emissions from industry, and find ways to use the carbon in CO2 as a feedstock, not only for the agriculture, where we are quite big already in the Netherlands, but also for chemistry, agrochemistry, of course, also fuels and mineralization. So in so many industry pathways, there is a market for CO2 as a feedstock. Well, that being our strategy, let's first see how we go into the field of infrastructure. And there we have, well, you might say some competitive advantage in the Netherlands, because there are a lot of projects under development already. Here we see the Porthos CCUS project that aims to be live in 2024 and scaling up to multi-millions of tons of CO2 capture and storage a year. But in the end, the Porthos project partners see that using CO2 as a feedstock is the phase 2 of this project. So if we have the infrastructure, if we have the capture, we might be able to use the CO2 even more smart than only storing it. So that's the south end of our grid. The middle part of our grid is already in place and operational. It's being operated by OCAP, that's a daughter of Lindegas, and it at this moment transports around 600,000 tons of CO2 a year to greenhouse industry. But the market in the greenhouse industry in the Netherlands is around 2.5 million tons. So there's a lot to scale up there, but also that a pipeline can be serving as a buffer or a well, accelerator for the grid between the 3 projects we see, because the third one we have is the next CCUS project under development that should be live in 2026 or 2027. And that's the CCUS project Athos, working with the Harbor of Amsterdam and Tata Steel. But they have for 2026 CO2 as a feedstock already very sharp on their agenda. So there you see a very smart grid coming to fruition in the coming years. But that grid is located in the largest petrochemical cluster in the world. It's lying in 2 of the largest harbors of Europe. We have an abundance of chemical and tech companies that can do something with that CO2 and that aim to do something with that CO2. A lot of universities, renowned research institutes, incubators, and a lot of private equity being interested in these projects and sites as well. So we have the investment climate, we have the infrastructure to accelerate CO2 as a feedstock. Well, if we have that, does the government work with us then? Because we need two things. We need the subsidy framework and of course the policy framework. Well, regarding subsidy framework, and I'm sorry to say this is in Dutch, but in essence what this says is that from TRL 1 to 9, we have a lot of different subsidy programs. There are around 8 national programs where CCU is explicitly part of the scope of these subsidy programs. So that's something that really changed in the last 2 years, that CCU is exactly on the agenda of our national policy makers. And that's also illustrated by the picture you see here on the right, where we have a national climate plan infographic stating how do we want to go through this transition. And everywhere you see the red circles, there CO2 as a feedstock is mentioned. So in the Netherlands, we have the long-term policy and the long-term solutions on the agenda, but we don't have the short-term solutions in place yet. And that's referring to what Célia said. CCU isn't in the scope of ETS yet, and we actually are working with mineralization companies that really do store CCS, but that's not recognized under the ETS. So that's a problem still, very much. But it's also a problem for the specific Dutch context, because our climate law and our Dutch emission tax, or specific Dutch emission tax, does follow the European guidelines regarding ETS and such. So we really have to change something at the European level to be able to change the impact on the national level as well. What's interesting is that negative emissions, something we are all talking about, but really valuing carbon molecules coming from bio in the industrial context isn't really recognized yet, only under the RED II development, I must say. But for the rest, it isn't. We should be able to value bio CO2 in another way than it's being done at this moment. And of course, there's a lot of criticism, maybe cynicism even, around CCU, but because how many energy does it take to find and to produce synthetic fuels, and in the end, over the whole life cycle, what is the actual CO2 emission score? We really are advocating for a European standard on the life cycle analysis. And that's needed also, of course, to be able to connect CCU to the ETS. But this really is something that should be done at the European level. So the Netherlands is participating in the Phoenix initiative as well, a more strategic lobby program that really wants to influence that side of the development in the European context. Well, in this specific Dutch context, bringing CO2 to the greenhouse industry, preferable from waste incineration facilities, because they have for like 60% biogenic CO2, is recognized and being set into place in the national subsidy structure, hopefully this year. So that's going very well. That's not the case yet for mineralization, but I'll show you that there are new solutions and new initiatives that might accelerate that as well. And as we know, well, with chemicals and fuels, we really need the LCA approach to be able to connect it to the ETS and to really start valuing it. So there we have a very strong need of short-term solutions. But what we at CO2 Smart Use focus the most on is accelerating the network. That's where we think should be coming the real change. Business investing and believing in sustainable solutions with an alternative carbon base. That's what we really want to do. And for that, we started working on a database with partners in the Netherlands that really want to work on that. And we have now around 50 partners really wanting to make a change. And you can see at our website what partners are already involved in that database. And what we try to do is make them connect with each other, organize events, and find specific challenges to discuss with them, just to bring those people in contact with each other and find new solutions. That's the core of CO2 Smart Use. Good to say is that we are being funded by the GasUnie, that's the national gas grid operator, by the province of South Holland, the regional province Juliana is going to talk about in a minute. And OCAP, the daughter of Linde, that's already operating a CO2 network in the Netherlands, and the Dutch greenhouse industry. And we are looking for additional funding partners for this network as well. But we strongly believe that in the end, showing the solutions will accelerate politics and will, in the end, accelerate policies. So we really want to bring forward the good solutions we are working on in the Netherlands. And I'll just show you a few of them illustrate what we really want to achieve and are achieving in the Netherlands. Well, for instance, this one is the waste incineration plant of Suez Re-Energy in Roosendaal in the Netherlands. And they are now preparing a project to bring 70,000 tons a year to 2 greenhouse areas that are in the neighborhood. And with that project, they will stop using natural gas in the 2 greenhouse areas and that amount accounts to around 100 million cubical meters of natural gas a year by bringing CO2 from this facility to the greenhouse areas. This one should be operational in 2024. Here we have a CO2 capture plant, and that's bringing CO2 to greenhouse areas already in Duiven, near Arnhem in the Netherlands. That's also connected to the waste incineration facility of AVR. This is really a lighthouse project. And what they are doing at this moment is they are building a demo plant with Carbon8, the UK-based company that is into mineralization of bottom ashes. And they are now learning in Duiven on how to scale up and how to use the ashes from that facility to bring the product to the market. And at the same time, we hosted a session at the European Industry and Energy Summit last year in December, I thought it was. And there we introduced carbon upcycling to the Netherlands. We did the same with Carbon8 a few years ago, and they are now building. We have now introduced carbon upcycling to the Dutch market, and we hope them to be able to build their solutions in the Netherlands as well. Well, as a lot of you people might know, we are already having a few businesses in the Netherlands that work with biological capture solutions around CO2. That's Photonol, you find them, and Omega Green as well. And I was wanting to highlight this one, Deep Branch, a company that uses CO2 and hydrogen by a fermentation process to produce proteins that will help you avoid importing the proteins from the South of America, and thereby not only directly but also indirectly having a very large positive footprint on industry, mainly for fish and chicken industry. And they now have their pilot being built in Geleen in the Netherlands, and they are looking at where to scale up. But they are very active in the Netherlands as well. Well, as you might know, we have the biomethanol facility of BioMCN in the Netherlands already. And they are starting to use not only biomass, but also CO2 as a direct source for producing methanol. We also have in the Netherlands a startup, like there are a lot of them in the meantime, that use just air, capturing CO2 and energy from the air to produce fuels. They are starting up, but we also work with Anastasios in the Netherlands that recently are working very close. I'm sorry for my slides there, want to go forward. But, they are working very closely with Climeworks as well. And then we go to what really has been, well, making us very enthusiastic the last months. And that's around aviation fuel, where we saw that KLM, our Dutch flight organization, did operate the first passenger flight ever with synthetic kerosene developed by Shell in Amsterdam. And the interesting thing is that at the same time, we are preparing the realization of a sustainable aviation fuel factory in Amsterdam as well. And at the same time, in Rotterdam, at the Rotterdam airport, they are scaling up or working on the first direct air capture to aviation fuel facility ever. So there we saw some initiatives that are under development in the Netherlands regarding mineralization, chemicals and fuels. Well, that's in fact what's happening in the Netherlands, and we are very proud of that. But we are also very happy to see the European network working on the policy background. We really need to scale up this network further. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Petrus. Quite a complete overview of the Dutch network of CCU professionals. Also some questions for you, but we will keep them at the end. I would like now to give the floor to Juliana to explain the perspectives of South Holland and their CCU program.
Thank you, Anastasios. Good morning, everyone. My slides will be shared by Antonio, so I'm having some network issues, but I hope everything will run smoothly. So I'm Juliana Unger. I work for Cleantech Delta, and we are the Cleantech cluster in South Holland. And as a triple helix cluster, we work on accelerating circular innovation. A little over a year ago, we have set up the regional CCU program together with our partners, which you can see on the bottom of the slide. SmartPort, which is a knowledge platform that finances and performs scientific research and knowledge dissemination for innovation within the port. Another partner is Innovation Quarter, the development agency for the province of South Holland. And then we have Delta Links, a business association of more than 700 companies, representing more than 90% of all logistics, port and industrial companies in the main port in Rotterdam. And our partnership brings together the expertise and know-how and the ecosystem to accelerate the deployment of CCU technologies in our region. Next slide, please. Yeah, so our vision is to become a circular feedstock hub and a sustainable energy port based on waste, biomass, and in the theme of today, CO2. In the interim to becoming that, the ecosystem, the facilities, and the infrastructure that we have in place provide an environment that is highly suitable for real-life testing of CO2 valorization technologies. And our approach in effectively bringing together the right partners from science, industry, and government is twofold. So firstly, prioritizing the most promising options of CCU for the region and validating attractive, innovative companies with technologies that fit these priorities. And then secondly, accelerate the development and the deployment of these priorities via joint efforts. And during this presentation, I would like to provide you with more information as to why South Holland is uniquely positioned to become a circular feedstock hub and a real-life testing ground for CO2 valorization. But before I do that, I have two slides to share with you how we as a program look at CCU. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the global market size for CO2 utilization in the next decade is to reach a market size of around $100 billion US. And beyond that, by 2040, it's supposed to reach $550 billion. So that means that CCU is not only an opportunity to reduce and mitigate CO2 emissions and reach decarbonization targets, but also to future-proof our industries and our economic activities. And what that graph also shows is that the market for CCU is mainly driven by technologies for CO2 utilization in building materials, such as the mineralization of concrete, where Petrus has given an example, as well as fuels and chemicals, both intermediates as well as end products, such as polymers. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this image might be familiar to many of you. It's based on a visual from the Renewable Carbon Initiative from the Nova Institute in Germany. And it basically depicts how a circular carbon economy, of which CCU is a part, both enables and requires the transition towards a renewable and sustainable energy system. And this is in line with what Célia said earlier. CCU is not the solution, but part of a portfolio of solutions to decarbonize our economy. Technological innovations in energy-intensive industries have traditionally emerged within the boundaries of a specific sector. And now that these industries are facing the challenge of decarbonizing, a significant reduction in GHG emissions is expected to be achieved across sectors. And accessing knowledge and other resources from industrial sectors, as well as co-developing industrial symbiosis concepts, can be mutually beneficial in the search to become fossil-free and reduce emissions. So to exploit the potential of this type of innovation, it is really important to understand not only the technical innovations themselves, but in particular the non-technical influencing factors that can drive the successful implementation of CCU innovation projects. Next slide, please. So what is it that makes South Holland unique? Well, on the one hand, South Holland is facing an enormous climate and economic challenge in the transition towards a sustainable economy. The Port of Rotterdam industrial complex alone is responsible for more than 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the Netherlands. Then South Holland is also characterized by a high volume of CO2 point sources. One step back, yes. It has hydrogen and a good CO2 infrastructure, and foremost of a large petrochemical supply chain and ecosystem. But most importantly is that businesses and authorities in South Holland are committed to the transition towards a low carbon, sustainable and future-proof industry. Next slide, please. Yes. So some of the ambitious initiatives that are located in South Holland include H-Vision for blue hydrogen, Portos, which Petrus has mentioned before, the CCS program. We have different field labs like Plant 1 or the Field Lab for Industrial Electrification. And we are the Dutch bioport region. So the CCU program complements these existing programs and initiatives and functions as a critical piece in the portfolio of solutions to further the transition in the right direction. So when we choose opportunities for South Holland, we look at them by matching them to our regional strengths. And on the other side, also looking at what are globally the most promising CCU routes and technologies. In the next slide, yeah.
I just wanted to interrupt for a couple of seconds because I had a question that in the Q&A that we see yourself, but we don't see the slides. So I just want to ask the audience if it's just one person that doesn't see the slides, or is it something that many have experienced?
Yes, I can read that some other people can see this. I can see them myself, and I'm not sharing them. So I was assuming other people.
So I think it's just one person. So sorry for that, for the one who cannot see it, but it seems that all the others can see it. So it's okay. Thank you.
Oh, it's great to wake everyone up. I see everyone being active in the chat.
Okay.
It's great to see that people are actively listening. Well, we can go to the next slide. Yes, so this is an overview of the kind of priorities that we have identified for South Holland. We've chosen to focus on 4 pathways that are of particular interest. So if we go from the left to the right, you have the capture, and then you can choose between storage or utilization. And within utilization, you can choose non-conversion path, which means using the CO2 in greenhouses. Which, as Petrus showed before, is something that is being done in South Holland. You can also use it in the food and packaging industries, or you can also convert the CO2. And there is 6 different technology pathways to do so, and 3 are a priority of us for this region. So that's thermocatalytic, which combines the use of high temperatures with a catalyst. It's much like the refining and petrochemical industrial processes that are taking place today. The second path is electrochemical, which is a relatively new field in which electricity is directly used to convert CO2 into products. So for instance, CO2 electrolyzers. And the third pathway is mineralization, which means basically reactions that occur when minerals such as concrete are exposed to CO2. And next slide, please. Yeah, and I mentioned before that in the transition towards a more sustainable economy, it's not only important to look at the technologies, but also at the framework conditions. And we have analyzed the framework conditions that are in place in South Holland and that are constantly being developed. The left and the right circle, the feedstock and the markets, I will touch upon more in detail later. But the other very important framework conditions are that you need an ecosystem which provides technology development, knowledge and expertise, as well as piloting and demo facilities. And in South Holland, we have a lot of institutions that are well known to, I assume, many people on the call, including the Technical University of Delft, Field Labs, TNO, Yes Delft, which is an incubator. We have industrial sites and the infrastructure. I'm not going to dive further into that, but OCAP, CCS, just to name a few. And there's also access to capital in the form of both public and private funding, for instance, through grants and subsidies on a regional, on a national level, but also from the EU level, of course. And in the Netherlands, we also have a stable and coherent policy framework that provides an economic motivation to actually deploy CCU technologies. Next slide, please. Yeah, so an overview of the feedstock situation of CO2 in South Holland. The EU ETS registered industry in South Holland produced 27 million tons of CO2 from different point sources with varying CO2 purity, but most of it came from industrial processes and from post-combustion activities. Next to the CO2 as a feedstock, there's a large renewable infrastructure in place or being built in South Holland. Think of offshore wind energy and also a hydrogen ecosystem. Next slide, please. Yes. So the Port of Rotterdam comprises more than 50 chemical companies, more than 5 oil refineries, a bunch of palm oil refineries, biofuel producers, power plants, and so on. And the Port of Rotterdam is actually home to Europe's largest bio-based chemical cluster and is the methanol hub within the Antwerp, Rotterdam, Rhine-Ruhr area, Amsterdam. I forgot, which represents 40% of the petrochemical industry in the European Union. So what this really means is that there are multiple petrochemical value chains in place where these CCU technologies can lock onto. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is my last slide, and it's just a snapshot of the industry and the players that we have in South Holland. It's by no means exclusive, but it's just to give a bit of an understanding how do the different stakeholders map along the different CCU opportunities that fit our prioritization pathways for CCU in South Holland. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliana. Sorry again for the interruption, and thank you for this overview of how the South Holland region is expected to move forward with CCU. As before, we will keep the Q&A for the end. So now I would like to give the floor to the Spanish case. So to Luis Diaz Fernandez, the president of the CO2 Technology platform, to explain the Spanish situation. So Luis, the word is yours if you can share your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First, I wish to thank CO2 Value Europe for giving us this opportunity to share some insights of CCU technologies in Spain. So this is our index. We're gonna take a look at the current situation in Spain, then what's coming next, the main CCU initiatives in Spain, and a little introduction of the Spanish CO2 technology platform. Of the current situation, if you take a look at the chart below, we see Spain is well over the average of the European Community emissions. So, if you see again the Global CCS Institute Readiness Index, we are in Spain are, let's say, average in this readiness index. If we take a look a little historical evolution, you see first period from 2006 to 2011 of great initiatives, and then came the financial crisis, and we started a 4 years period of reduced funding and the end of big projects. From 2014, so we turned to R&D projects, mainly in the utilization area. So, during this last period, we were asked to identify, we are asked, of course, by the Spanish administration to identify priority technology initiatives, and we found this in capture. Mainly, we are trying to focus on calcium looping and chemical looping, the capture side. And in the utilization side, we focused on mineralization technologies, fertilizer production, methanol production, polymer production, and solar fuels. So what's coming next? We can see Spain's strategy for greenhouse gas reduction up to 90% in 2050, including efficiency, electrification, renewables, and there's a part of the CCU somewhere over there. So if we take a look at what are the main challenges and the good news in Spain, the main challenges are we are still in the polluter pays principle versus an insufficient cost of CO2. It is cheaper to pay than a real CCU implementation. There are some legal barriers. We are the first European country to transpose the regulation directive into Spanish law, but there are no more of regulation was achieved, was stopped there. And still we have a problem with public acceptance barriers versus local successful projects. The good news are the long-term decarbonization strategy, a good roadmap to the Spanish cement industry to achieve climate neutrality in 2050, including CCU and CCS, more opportunities for funding, especially in the R&D area, more upcoming industrial projects, and we are still the Spanish technology platform pushing forward the technology. Now, taking a look at the main CCU initiatives in Spain, there's some key singular technological infrastructures. The first one should be CIUDEN, which is a three-parts initiative. First, they have a capture plant and fluidized bed oxy-combustion technology in Cubillos. They have some geological storage laboratory in Hontoming, and they have a rig for trying different kind of piping for transport futures. Another infrastructure should be La Pereda, which is a calcium looping capture plant. It captures 1.7 megawatt thermal megawatts calcium looping pilot, capturing around 1% of the combustion gases of the power station. Another infrastructure should be a small 30 kilowatts, 30 thermal kilowatts was the beginning of the calcium looping investigation in Spain, which is also in Asturias, in Instituto Nacional del Carbón. Repsol has a very interesting strategic plan 2021-2025 focusing in net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. A lot of initiatives, a lot of projects, and Repsol is the main oil company in Spain, and they are part of our platform too. Lafarge Holcim is the first cement company to install a carbon capture plant in Spain. They're trying to capture the CO2 emitting in the cement industry process for agricultural use for accelerating crop production. Then we have the IMDEA Energy Institute in Madrid. They are focusing in utilization, mainly in pyrolysis and hydrodesulfonation, and some microalgae, microorganisms growing with CO2. Carburos Metálicos, again, they have they're trying a new plant in Soria, which is to use capture CO2, capture CO2 from biomass plant, clean it, and then give it to liquefied form for greenhouse production around. This is PTCO2 members. We are 45, and I think we are growing. You see, we have members of all kind of industries, cement, energy production, Repsol, which is oil and gas companies. We have a lot of universities membership, and some small companies also involved. Well, this is this kind of our organization chart with General Assembly and Advisory Board, an Executive Committee, and then President and 3 Vice Presidents. We are trying to do many as many manuals on these technologies as we can, and we participate in a lot of different other platforms and alliance for research and innovation. So this is a small check of our links in our social networks. Please feel free to contact us in any occasion, any reason. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. I will give the floor directly now to Linda. We will go back to the European perspective now. We've heard two case studies on the Netherlands and in Spain about the development of the CCU industry there. And at the beginning, we heard about the European context of CCU, and now we will go back on the more, let's say, transnational considerations about CCU and how the R&D needs for CCU deployment match industrial realities. So Linda, the word is yours.
Yes, thank you, Anastasios. Just to check, you can see my screen here?
We can see your screen, yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here today, and thank you for the invitation, Anastasios and CO2 Value Europe. My name is Linda Veldhuizen, and I'm Program Coordinator for Synergy. And today I would like to talk about the CCU R&D needs from an industry perspective from across Europe. Please note that I do not have an industry background, actually, but I would like to use that to my advantage today to take a step back and observe what I see and hear from within the Synergy community and also through interactions with others. So I mentioned Synergy, but what is Synergy? Well, Synergy is a European initiative that works towards fossil-free fuels and chemicals. So we represent the research, development, innovation communities within industry and academia, and we also work with other societal actors working towards the fossil-free future. So our aim is to enable a circular economy by developing fossil-free fuels and base chemicals for industry and agriculture through technologies that make use of the resources that are abundant in Europe. And of course, CCU technologies are key to achieve this aim. I will not talk specific R&D needs today because I'm sure many of you have a better idea of what those are than me. But instead, I will focus on these 5 questions here that challenge industry today and in the future. And I will elaborate on these points in the next 5 to 10 minutes before ending with a reflection on the role that Synergy can play. So the CCU in industry starts from the companies themselves. At the moment, there's not much legislation forcing companies to adopt CCU technologies. Happy to hear that CO2 Value Europe is working on this. And also the cost effectiveness of many of these technologies are not that competitive yet. It's still easier to use fossil resources than any of these technologies. So this means you have front runners and you have laggards. So the front runners are on the left of this figure and the laggards are on the right. And the more conventional ones that follow the mass are somewhere in the middle. So the industry I'm talking about today is on the left. These are the front runners. These are the companies that have a strong drive to develop and to implement CCU technologies. And perhaps an interesting question for the discussion later today is how you can get more companies to join the front runners. But yeah, first to these front runner companies. And when they want to implement CCU technologies, they face these 5 questions, which is first, which technology can you use? Which one is applicable to you and how can you make it useful for you? How do you finance such a technology? Who do you work with? How can you deal with risk? And where is all this going? What will the future bring? So I will go through these questions now one by one. The first one is, which CCU technology can I use? It starts with a very basic question, but you need to know what's out there. Which technology can you use? In general, we see that companies keep a very close eye on the higher TRL technologies. And at the same time, they also keep a bit of an eye on the emerging technologies. Large companies usually have the larger R&D departments, but they also focus on a wider range of technologies. And with the smaller companies, they focus on less technologies, but these are usually also the companies that work on, like it's the startups that work on developing these technologies. And then sometimes the larger companies pick up these technologies as they become available. So I think that's really the beauty of the value chain. Everyone has their part to play in bringing these technologies to the next level and to their best use. But the company will not only look at the technology in itself, but also look at how it meets the company needs and circumstances. Like, do you have the necessary space? What does it mean for your production lines? What other technologies do you need? Do you need to adapt processes? Do you need new staff? Will you have to change suppliers or customers, etc.? So it's really a time-consuming, costly process of tailoring. And the costs are usually for you as a company, especially in this last step. So how do you finance this? Because financing CCU technology and R&D and implementation, it's crucial, but it's challenging. Because in the first part, it is about, in the first part, technology has to be brought from lower to higher TRL. So it usually starts with public funding for science and industry R&D, but gradually it shifts to private funding. So I can imagine that the amount of private investment that's needed can make some companies decide to step out. Because with all the goodwill in the world, you need to prioritize in the first instance, make sure your company survives. Because if we have companies adopting CCU technologies and then they go out of business, we'll still end up nowhere. But if you do prioritize the deployment of a certain CCU technology, you will look at its cost effectiveness and general business model, but also the risk of disinvestment, the chance that it leads to unfavorable lock-ins, the gains in public acceptance, current and future incentives such as subsidies and penalties. So it's a cost-benefit analysis, and it's a tricky one to make because not all benefits are monetary and private, but all the costs come down to your company. So there is an important role for collaboration. You need to work with European funding agencies, with investors, with other companies working on this to reduce these risks. And this collaboration brings me to my next point. Who do you work with? You may need new collaborations to develop relevant CCU technologies or to finance their development and implementation. But implementing a new technology will probably involve a lot more new suppliers of technology and inputs, new customers, or even new markets, new products, new relations and trust to build, new contracts. So it takes more effort than staying on the current path. So our front runners really are a motivated bunch. And one particularly interesting challenge is whether your CCU technology gives rise to new or changed value change. It could be that your waste stream becomes some other company's input or vice versa. So it's interesting, who takes the initiative to set this up? How do you find the right partners? And can you do that as a group of companies, or is an external partner or some external financing more useful? Because you sometimes see projects and initiatives for this, but who takes the initiatives and what is your go-to place for this? And yeah, back to the role of financing, which is just one of the bigger challenges, I think. So it shifts from public to private funding, but it's not just about knowing the price tag and the additional requirements to tailor it to your needs. It's also about the financial risk it poses to your company. Because for a company that wants to invest in innovations, you want to make sure that the returns are high and the risks are low. That would be the ideal situation, of course. So you need to consider many performance indicators of many potential technologies. And it may be hard to oversee this, and perhaps not all information is available. So that adds to the risk. So what companies would like to see is some sort of insight into best bets or an overview of performance indicators of these upcoming technologies. Now, one risk I find particularly interesting is the risk of lock-ins. It comes down to the point how well a technology fits into your current operations. And if you need some sort of modifications, that requires additional investment. And you really need to, or you want to make sure that with these new investments, you don't lock into a certain path without any alternatives. So you really want a future innovation to work as well with those new changes you make. So you also need some insight on what's to come for that. And that is a particularly tricky one. What does the future have in store for all of us? And if you think of doing an investment, you need to know what the future will bring. Now, companies have a good sense of what their financial situation will be in the years to come. But when it comes to a circular carbon economy, does anyone know where we're headed? Like, who will be the big players in this new field? How can I get on board? What's my role? What will be my core business? What will my clients demand? So these are questions that everyone has, but that not anyone has a real answer to. But it's a motivation for companies to stay ahead with the front runners, to get more insights in this, and perhaps also to have some influence on this. Now, before I send you home with a lot of questions and no answers, I wanted to come back to Synergy, because several of the points I raised here are what we aim to address or contribute to. So we are committed to helping to bring first-generation technologies to scale with better affordability and performance. So that's the first bullet point here, where electrochemical and thermochemical processes are developed and optimized to convert renewable energy into fuels and chemicals. This is the first generation technology, but we are also strongly supporting the development of the next generation of technologies for the direct conversion of solar energy to fuels and chemicals. And for both these first and second generation technologies, we focus on the science and on the questions for industry for improvements in efficiency, cost effectiveness, and other priorities for industry. And of course, we also focus on the scale up and the integration of these technologies. So as I said in the previous slides, Synergy starts from strong science-industry collaboration, but we also advocate for the necessary funding and the required policies. So, and in addition to these links between science, industry, and policy, Synergy is also about forming a community, a platform where you can find answers to all these questions I raised, and where your work can be supported, connected to the work of others, and enabled to overcome some of these challenges I outlined today. And the goal of Synergy is to unite the community working on fossil-free fuels and chemicals so that we can achieve more and bring the fossil-free future closer and sooner rather than later. So we aim to be this community that supports and enables change. And we aim to do that through a European partnership in 2024. That's what we're working towards now, but that's still far away. So while we are preparing for that, we also started to build this community and to develop and implement a strategic research and innovation agenda. We also developed a portfolio of projects for funding, advocated with the European Commission, organized events to encourage knowledge sharing and networking, etc. So before we can be this partnership, we try to already be a community or a partnership that can be of value to you. And that brings me to my last slide, where I would like to invite you to join our next event, which is an industry webinar on the 9th of March, a national workshop for those of you working in Poland on the 2nd of March. And that's how we try to reach out to everyone in Europe. We will continue with these events, so you can sign up to the newsletter or subscribe to our social media channels. And we would love to receive your support in the form of a support letter. And you can always get in touch with us via this email address or our website. And thank you for your time. Back to you, Anastasios.
Thank you very much, Linda, for these, let's say, reflections from an industrial perspective and questioning that industrial actors do among themselves. We're very well in time. I will invite all speakers now to show themselves. I've been following the Q&A, and I will be asking. Some are not directed to a specific person. Some are. So I think I will start with the sequence as we heard the speaker. So first with Célia, and I also invite all the entire audience to use the chat function now to explain what you have understood as the main takeaway messages, also from the Q&A session now, so that we can close with some discussions and some sentences of the audience directly. So starting with Célia, there was a question on the importance of environmental assessment of CCU technologies, in the sense that some of them are emerging, some of them are not commercialized yet. So how important would be for the future deployment of those technologies to have a proper environmental assessment, let's say LCA, in their future deployment?
It's of course absolutely crucial that not only the new technologies, but also all the older technologies are assessed in a holistic way for the environmental and climatic impact via a life cycle analysis. So it means that it accounts for the whole life cycle. So from the creation of the product all the way to what will happen afterwards. So even from the capture to the creation or the conversion to what will happen afterwards. And it's very important not only to assess the impact of the technology, but also to assess the conditions around it. Because, for example, a certain type of technology might have a very positive impact for a certain type of application at a certain geographical setting, while it will not have the same impact in another setting. So it's extremely important to have a broad vision of what will happen, and to really take one type of technologies or one type of methodology, but also per type of applications. And also in what I could add is that in EU projects, it's of course asked to show that the technologies that are developed have a positive environmental and climatic impact.
And if I may add, we also see, as you showed in your slides, we also see in the let's say recent days and months that all the more studies, scientific studies come out on LCA for different CCU products. So this is very important for the scientific foundation behind CCU, and and it will also, what we believe, it will also help policymakers take up these messages faster if they see that it's properly founded with LCA backed studies. Another question was on polymers. So where would you see polymers in terms of the three categories that you mentioned of CO2 based products, in the sense of let's say CO2 sequestration potential, how permanent it would be?
So polymers will be taken into the account in the CO2 to chemicals. So it's a chemical. It will involve a net reduction of CO2 emissions, and according to what happened with the polymer, so with the material that is made out of polymer afterwards, so if it's fully recycled or not, it will depend if we reach net zero emissions or not. But at that stage, when we see what happens with the majority of polymers, we cannot say that CO2 is permanently sequestered in polymers. It can be sequestered on maybe a 5 year, 10 years, 20 years, maybe 50 years time scale. But what will happen afterwards with the material that is very important again. So if it's just let as a waste in a landfill, the CO2 will get back to the CO2 cycle at some point, to carbon cycle at some point. So it's extremely important to be able to completely recycle polymers, which is technically quite complicated at that point.
Which also brings me to the question of how permanent at the end is the sequestration character of mineralization.
Yeah, mineralization, originally it's a natural process that creates limestone. So you take the CO2 to create stone, with minerals, with calcium and CO2, you create limestone. So it's normally a natural process that occurs on very, very long time scale. What we do with mineralization when we want to capture CO2 into building material is that we accelerate this process, but we do make stone out of CO2. So it's very complicated to get the CO2 out. We will need to heat it at very, very high temperature to get it out. So we can really consider that the CO2 is stored there permanently. It really becomes a rock. It's part of a rock.
Yes. And another question where I would also need maybe the feedback of Louise is. It's a rather interesting question. Why do you think, so both Célia and Louise, why do you think that the energy intensive industries currently are not yet commercially implementing CCU technologies? What would be the main, let's say, obstacle for that? Would it be a technology maturity? Would it be the policy signals? What do you consider the main reason why it has not yet been commercially implemented by energy-intensive industries?
I think that the technology is not the problem, because the technology are improving very fast and the technology are there now to do CCU. What is lacking is the favorable policy framework and proper market incentives. And right now, the industry do not have really advantage to do CCU. So it's cheaper, as Linda said, I think also, it's cheaper to just send the CO2 to the atmosphere than to reuse it. So we definitely need a better, a more favorable regulatory framework to help in that direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. Still, as I said before, it's still cheaper to pay than to reduce. So policy should be based on taxation, big taxation, or just as we are trying to do in Spain, eliminate fossil power sources. I don't know. We still need the natural gas because of how is the power market or power production in Spain. But still, we need to reduce capture cost. Of course, even the technologies are there, and I think this is a small step for reducing this cost. And we need still to increase the utilization amount. So utilization is a very small portion yet still, and we need to increase this utilization by a lot.
Which brings me, Luis, to another question that has been asked in the Q&A, and maybe also Petrus can comment on that. Do you see already like something like a minimum size of captured CO2 process that would make the CCU pathway commercially viable? I mean, I guess it depends on many factors and on the product side, but what could we consider, let's say, ranges of capacities above which we will consider a CO2 a CCU, let's say, installation as commercially viable? Have you had this kind of exchange within your own networks?
Yes, we did. Well, it completely depends on your point source, but also the market you are providing to, and the reason why to capture the CO2. For instance, we have the biomass vergisting. I don't know the English word for it, but they produce natural gas out of biomass. But to be able to feed that into the national grid, you have to get the CO2 out of the biogas. So, and that CO2 is just emitted into the air at the moment. Pure CO2 being emitted into the air. So that are comparatively very small capture plants, but they already are in the market. You could also approach it from the market question point of view, where we see, for instance, in the Netherlands, if you can feed into the greenhouse industry, there is a gap of well, hundreds of thousands of tons to be filled. So if you can come up with a solution, for instance, the Osiris project that delivers 70,000 or 50,000 tons a year, that's commercially viable when the subsidy scheme hits in at the end of this year. And well, you might say that economies of scale will get us to the real sizes. Well, for instance, we have, of course, the Porthos project, where the hydrogen production facilities in the Rotterdam harbor area are aiming for capture facilities of up to maybe even 1 million tons a year. So it's all about your point source. It's about the market you are providing to, and it's about the reason why you would be capturing the CO2. So it's a very diverse answer. I'm sorry.
No.
And again, it's coming back to the pricing. It all depends on the price of the CO2. The viability of a project of capture and wherever is still pointed by the real price of emissions. In Spain, for instance, you may know that our power industry is becoming without fossil fuels, but we have a problem with the rest of the industry. We have a problem with the chemical, cement and steel industries. These are great emitters, and but they are subjected to the same CO2 price market. So we have to check on that pricing to see feasibility for projects.
Agreed.
Which also brings me to a kind of a similar question. What would be the, let's say, what would be the trigger to we know, let's say, that the cost of some CCU products is superior than the one of their than the market price of conventional products. So what would be, from your perspective, the trigger to shift the balance in order to bring CCU to the market at comparable prices?
Yes, I think in the end, it's all about inevitability. Because we can discuss this for a very long time, but producing chemicals and fuels out of CO2 is a horrendous job. It costs a lot of energy, and it will, pure on a cost size, never be competitive to fossil-based alternatives. That's not going to happen, only with taxes and other policy instruments. So if we believe that using fossil carbon as a feedstock is an ending market, then we don't have another option than to invest in CO2 from biomass, from waste, and in the end, from the air as an alternative feedstock to fossil carbon. It's about inevitability. If we believe that, then we are okay, and it's reasonable to invest in something that will cost more than it does at this moment.
There was a question, I will address it also to Juliana, because it was during the time that she was presenting. So it's how to combine and how to bring together the CCU strategies for the next years and the green hydrogen strategies. So inevitably, hydrogen is let's say a basic component for CCU. So first of all, have you discussed within the South Holland CCU consortium what kind of capacities of green hydrogen would be required within the consortium, and how the hydrogen strategies in the region coincide and overlap with the CCU strategies?
Yeah, good question. We have not, we did not decide on any figures, or haven't discussed immediately how much hydrogen would be needed, but I think this question can be looked at from two sides. So it's expected that the production of hydrogen will not reach any impactful size until 2030, and only from 2040, 2050 onwards reach the scale necessary to meet the demand. And as far as green hydrogen is concerned, there's not yet a sufficient supply of renewable electricity to produce it. And it's also about going through learning curves and the cost curves associated with scaling up hydrogen production. And until then, interim solutions will have to be used to meet the current demand. And I think that's where CCU can, or CCUS can play a role in helping, let's say, moving away from gray hydrogen in the short term. And then on the longer term, the perspective message around that when we have sufficient hydrogen, that we can also scale up certain CCU technologies.
Okay.
I think Petrus also has a comment on that. He amused himself.
Thank you, Juliana and Anastasios. Maybe what I can add to that is that in the Dutch industrial ecosystem, and that goes for the national policy as well, we understand and accept that we will never be able to produce enough green energy in the Netherlands, on the North Sea, or whatever, to meet the demand. For instance, Port of Rotterdam is aiming for a hydrogen market of around 20 million tons a year in 2050 to meet the demands in the Netherlands and Germany. So at the same time, what we are aiming for are industrial import projects for hydrogen. We really want to import that green hydrogen from places where we can make it competitively and add it in the regional chemical clusters to the sources and the technologies we have here.
Juliana, I will stay with you. There is an interesting question on of small SMEs, for example, developing conversion technologies and the easiness to access venture capital to raise their TRL levels at, let's say, industrial scale. And the question, and if any other of the panelists can answer, it's very welcome, is how can we, let's say, help, and it's a question also addressed to CO2 Value, I assume, how we can help educate those funding possibilities, those venture capitals, so that they can better support, let's say, upcoming ventures in this field.
Yeah, maybe to take a bit of a general answer on this one, if you look at the European Investment Bank, which is providing also different forms of financing for SMEs in Europe, they are going to implement a shadow cost of carbon of 250 euros per ton, and it's going to increase over the next decennia to 800 euros per ton. So you can really see that they are starting to take into consideration the externalities of CO2, which means naturally that CCU and related decarbonization technologies will become more investable, let's say, and will have more access to different sources of financing.
Which brings me to another question asked is, with these disruptive technologies coming in, where are we heading for on the cost of carbon and capture? Maybe Luis, from your experience in the different examples that you've shown on carbon capture, is there something, let's say, would you be able to see where we are heading on in terms of pricing of carbon capture?
At least in my experience in calcium looping, because I was the director of this La Pereda plant in Spain, we were aiming at trying to fix a reality of 30 euros per ton. This is the minimum we were checking, let's say. So everything in the tax or the market price over 30 something euros should be enough for this kind of technology. But take account that this technology is mainly for power use. They are checking it in the cement industry and see how they can use it, because the main solvent in the calcium looping, of course, is limestone, and limestone is part also in the cement industry. So I think we can make it even cheaper. We'll see.
Okay. Juliana, we had a question on why this preference on those three CCU technologies, thermo-electro-mineralization. Is this something linked to the Dutch case, or do you see also the same thing happening at European scale, or what is the reasoning, let's say, behind this decision to focus on those three lists of technologies?
Yeah, the selection of the priority areas is very much specific to South Holland, so to the province in the Netherlands. For instance, why did we not take photosynthetic pathways into consideration? Well, it's an open pond of the open pond algae systems, which require a lot of light and a lot of space, which is just something that we don't have here. South Holland is the most densely populated area in the Netherlands. As for other processes, also some biological microbial processes to produce cheap bulk chemicals, they just have very slow reactions, which implies that they need large process facilities that cannot compete with thermochemical routes in this area. So the selection to focus on thermocatalytic, electrochemical, and mineralization pathways is really a combination of what infrastructure do we have in place, which are the markets that the output products can dock into, and are these products that come out high value products, essentially. And I guess that can look different for different regions. but for us, that is the case.
Mm-hmm. You touched a bit upon biological conversion, and maybe I will go to Linda, because I had an interesting question. Maybe you can explain also what some let's say pathways of synergy are looking at, how, let's say, what is the TRL level now of pathways that use CO2 as feedstock to produce further, let's say, low carbon molecules, 1 carbon, 2 carbon, to feed microorganisms to further produce different types of molecules. So how is the CO2 to biological conversion TRL level currently in the European context, and how synergy is also involved with that? And I think you're mute. No, you're not mute, but now you are mute, but we can't hear you, unfortunately. Well, just until you try to figure the technology behind the, I'll jump to another question, and we'll come back to you when the problem is fixed. And maybe a question to Célia. There's a comment that suggests that achieving negative emission is relatively easy when we're talking about BECCS or DACs. So what would be, let's say, the driver to consider CCU instead of those technologies to achieve negative emissions? And feel free, Petrus or Juliana, to chip in.
So I will first comment that I don't think it's easy to do a negative emission via BECCS and DAC plus CCS, because if it was easy, it would have been done for quite a while. So it's still a very expensive process, and it's very complicated. And CCS is not something that we can do anywhere, and it also has its limits. So I think I will see it as two complementary approaches, CCS and CCU. And the fact of storing CO2 into building material, it's not only to create negative emissions, but it's also to create circularity, because it means that we can also create new materials based on CO2 as a feedstock. So this is a big difference between CCU and CCS, is that CCU really creates new carbon feedstock. So it also defossilizes the processes. And here it will allow, for example, to burn less limestone to create cement, for example, doing this material, so using industrial waste and CO2 to create a material. So it is really a double effect. And I think it's very important also to consider the geographical setting, that because CCS is not something that can be done anywhere, and it's definitely not something that can be done easy. So our vision is that first, all emission possible should be avoided if it can be avoided, and then the CO2 should be recycled, and then if it can really not be recycled, it should be stored on the ground, because there are a lot of it's also a complicated thing and very costly thing to do.
Yes, I completely agree, Célia. The interesting thing we see in the Netherlands is that industry players are already asking specifically for green CO2 sources, because they prefer that hugely above to fossil CO2 sources, because in the end they can state that their product is more green than when we will be using fossil CO2. And that brings another question to the specific Dutch context already, and that's about certification. So we are now working in the Netherlands on how to certificate the greenness of the CO2 you want to use, because in the end that's going to drive the value a lot of your product. So storing biological CO2 may make sense from a climate perspective, but from a market perspective, it's a pretty stupid thing to do. putting it very bluntly.
If I may say something, there is also the problem of land use when you do BECCS, of course, because if you use biomass, so it's a solution, but again, it's not the solution. So we have to think large and take all the solutions for the different applications.
So there was a couple of questions on the jet fuel pathway, and first there was a question addressed to Petrus, whether you know more about the KLM Shell jet fuel pathway, and another question linked to that was where exactly in the innovation curve are we expecting to see the jet fuel pathway now?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm not a technician, so that helps me saying that I don't know how exactly the process is working from CO2 to kerosene. What I do know is that Shell published a movie on YouTube on how they use the CO2 to produce synthetic kerosene. So I'll just try and find the link in a moment and share it in the chat. But then again, it's being done already. We can do it. And we know we don't have the subsidy and the policy framework to really accelerate the use of synthetic kerosene at the moment. It should be valued in the reiteration of the RED II, I think. I'm not a specialist there also, thankfully. But when I see that 2 factories are being built and we are, I think, talking about a direct air capture to kerosene around TRL 3 or 4, but the other process where Sky Energy is participating as well, I think that's about TRL 7. So if we have the fitting policy and subsidy frameworks in place, I think we will be seeing industrial size factories around 2030 for synthetic kerosene. But just that's an inkling I have.
Mm-hmm. We also see a couple of projects coming out, as Célia talked about the Norsk e-fuel. Recently we had another conference on sustainable aviation fuel, where another promising project, the Zenit project, also was announced. So the aspiration is that we can have pre-commercial facilities in the next 3 to 4 years, in any case. And I also have a comment on the biological conversion for Ccu to chemicals, that apart from the CO2 pathway, let's say we can also have recycled carbon from industrial emissions to Ccu chemicals, a process already commercialized by using mainly CO in that case instead of CO2. So that is also a possibility on the biological conversion. I'll welcome again Linda to see if she now can. Now, unfortunately, the problem persists, Linda. It's okay. The questions that we cannot have live, we will take them up in writing, so you can explain more on that with the entire material. I will go back to the let's say venture capital questions, because I think the question was how we, like CO2 Value Europe, and I can respond to that, help let's say startups or smaller scale businesses to become more visible to investor communities in the EU. And I think one example of this would be our CVE day, CO2 Value Day in November last year, where we had a breakout session specifically on funding, and there we invited a commercial bank, BNP, to talk about what kind of things elements they're looking at when they want to invest and what kind of risk they can tolerate. And we also invited a venture capital, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, to explain their process on investing into startups and into let's say promising low TRL but high impact processes with large emission reduction potential. So this is part of our job, let's say, to answer to this question, how we can render CCU technologies more visible to willing investors from different perspectives, be it venture capital, be it a commercial bank, of course, public funding. So I hope this answers the questions on the visibility of low TRL or small size companies on that. Let me see, because we're also coming closely to an end. If I have some other questions, yes, there was a question to Petrus on the SDE++. So kind of Dutch, let's say, context here, and how it is expected to be to evolve in the future to include or not CCU.
Yes, well, the SDA++ is a specific Dutch OPEX subsidy measure that compensates the difference between your sustainable production process and the fossil alternative, to put it very simply. And it originates in the energy transition challenges. So it helps furthering wind and solar and the like sort of projects. But now hydrogen is being considered, and using CO2 is being considered as well. Well, in the end, the Dutch emission tax is steering what the Dutch market will do, and the Dutch emission tax in turn follows the ETS. So if in a few years I would be operating a mineralization project, but I cannot deduct the CO2 I am using in that mineralization project from my ETS or Dutch emission tax sum, I still will have to be paying the ETS price. And that can amount to, well, let's say 100 euros in 2030. So if I am heavily investing in a technology that can get me around 20-30 euros for my CO2, but I know in the end I will be paying around 100 tons for that same CO2 via the emission tax, I'm not helping myself. So yes, the SDE++ helps to bring a product to the market, but the reference, am I paying for the CO2, is going to define if I'm working on a feasible project or not. I don't know if this is a clear answer, Anastasios.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. It explains also how the Dutch, let's say, emission tax system follows the ETS, and how it affects the I guess the corporate decisions also on
Agreed.
on CCU or CCS. Well, I think we have reached, let's say, the end of our Q&A session. I would like to thank, of course, all of you for this exchange. This is, let's say, the beginning of our intention to approach more the national case, and to for two reasons. One reason is to understand how the challenges on the field at national scale and how we can bring those challenges to the attention of the European scale, where we mostly operate at CO2 Value Europe. So having this knowledge from a national point of view is crucial for us. And on the other side, make sure that the European context and the messages that we are trying to use to reach out to the relevant stakeholders, policymakers, are also diffused through the national channels to the national authorities, and that there is a harmonized message on the need to further deploy CCU technologies and uptake of CCU products in the market. We've heard today of the situation in two particular countries and the related challenges behind it. We understand that the industrial actors are ready to invest, and importantly, they need to have the correct signal from a regulatory point of view, from a policy point of view, that will allow them that will allow this confidence that their investment, their scaling up, will be recognized in the different policy schemes and supporting schemes. So for the remaining minutes, I would like to ask the audience to put in their chat what it is for them the key message of this workshop. We will use it to form the report of this workshop, and you will all you will all have access to it. Yeah, we'll stay tuned for our upcoming workshops. We're trying to have monthly workshops to discuss particular aspects of the CCU chain. And I would like to appeal to the audience to reach out to Petrus, reach out to Juliana for the Dutch actors, or let's say further professional networks of CCU actors that want to come together. Reach out to Luis for the Spanish case. Reach out to Linda for the research and innovation challenges for solar fuels and chemicals. Reach out to us to bring the CCU theme in a higher, let's say, priority place in the minds of the policymakers and the stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you all. Thank you to the audience, and take care, stay healthy. Please follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, follow the organizations of the speakers also on LinkedIn and Twitter, and stay tuned for further events explaining the CCU challenges and opportunities. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and keep safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.